next few months. And Stephen, over to you.
Cool. Can everyone hear me online as well? Now I got my microphone on, so if someone could validate that.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. All right, thanks everyone. Yeah, knowing it's 2.5 years since there's been a lot of in-person meetings, I feel privileged being an Australian that is the first one here to do this. So it's quite timely. So I was in Auckland for the next couple of days. So Richard organised and thought it'd be a good session to come down and present on a topic that I do quite a lot back home in Australia, and kind of something that's pertinent as well. I think the offering here and what Microsoft done is been really good, and can kind of go through some of those things as well. So it'll be a pretty open session. So if you have any questions, put in the chat, but most likely we'll capture them at the end. So just an introduction. So I'm a tech strategist from Insight. So also the APAC infrastructure and security lead. So I work across various different programs of work, mainly involving designing, implementing, and integration of Azure across kind of large enterprise customers. Also work closely with the Microsoft product team on various different things. So recently across some of the Azure Arc for Azure landing zones pieces of work and documentation that you've seen on the CAF landing zone documentation there. And also contribute to the various BICEP landing zone communities and public forums that work with Microsoft. So as part of my role, working as part of that community piece as well. And I regularly do meetups. So I'm from Perth, so still getting used to time zones. So if I fall asleep, please wake me up. And yeah, there's my kind of LinkedIn profile as well. Lastly, the only thing I got told not to talk about here is rugby. So we'll kind of leave the rest of that there. So I guess this is a very common scenario for a lot of customers today. So with the landscape of applications and infrastructure and workloads that are in place, customers' environments are kind of evolving to be very heterogeneous and disparate across various different technology. So, I'm assuming either you're a customer or a partner or working with these kind of people, this scenario will be very common. Lots of applications across various different technologies, IaaS, PaaS, serverless, lots of different programming languages, and very diverse infrastructure. So, things from edge computing to your traditional kind of VMware environments, branch offices, your traditional data centers. That's ever expanding and also becoming challenging to kind of manage and look after. And now we've got hybrid and kind of multi-cloud as well. So, when you push all of these together, from a management and operations perspective, it becomes very challenging and kind of hard to provide this kind of single pane of glass that is the nirvana that everyone wishes to achieve. And until recently, it's become, a challenging and kind of a marketing term. So what Microsoft have done with Arc has made it a lot easier to kind of at least get there and be able to provide some of these seamless hybrid management technologies and capabilities to those different workloads as well. And just on hybrid and multi-cloud, when I talk to customers about this, a lot of the large enterprise customers that I'm involved in Australia do multi-cloud, as much as I guess Microsoft would wish that there's only Azure. Unfortunately, there's other cloud providers that are there. So the way that I usually position this as well is when you talk hybrid, you're talking about apples and oranges, really, and being able to provide a kind of seamless environment together. Whereas multi-cloud, when you're looking at Google and AWS and Azure itself, it's apples, but it's a different kind of apple. So, where hybrid and multi-cloud, there's going to be a mixture of those for years to come across the various different technologies there as well. So when I talk to customers around their challenges, and a lot of my conversations are kind of with C-level people or technologists. So there's a desire to move to cloud, and there's things that customers want to do, but there's for various reasons, and depending on the customer, there's things that are in place or challenges that each customer have, and some of these are probably similar to a lot of organizations that you've worked with today. some of the points are relevant for specific people. Some of them, they address them all. Some of them get stuck on specific pieces. So a lot of these things that we talk about today will help to alleviate some of these challenges that are kind of in place. So specifically, what I want to go through today around Arc is looking at security and governance. So how can we leverage different environments and bring in some of those Microsoft security and governance tool sets and capabilities. Addressing the multi-cloud complexity. So I'll go through a use case that I've done back in Australia for a customer who've leveraged these technologies across multiple cloud environments. And also the tooling and automation. So with options becomes complexity and different tooling things that are in place. So being able to leverage those and do that makes it important and provides that kind of consistent experience as well. So I guess the spiel and the intro for Arc, I'll kind of start at a level 100 first. So it's essentially a software solution, and it enables the deployment of Azure services anywhere on any infrastructure in a distributed environment. So leveraging the Azure management control plane and the capabilities that Azure provides, allowing us to kind of address two main areas. So one is around infrastructure. So think your virtual machines, your servers, Kubernetes type infrastructure. And then the second is the Azure Arc enabled services. So your kind of data services. So think SQL managed instances, Postgres, so the kind of data layer that's there as well. So being able to provide that consistent experience across both of them is obviously important and kind of what we'll talk about today. So whether the servers are physical or virtual or Windows or Linux, so we're providing kind of a common platform to be able to do that across all of them as well. So my background is more server infrastructure and security. So I have a counterpart who is the AKS guy. So I won't be talking much about the Kubernetes and data services today. So it's going to be more about the server piece. But you know, please reach out if we want to talk about any of the other stuff in the future as well. The other thing that I like about Azure Arc as a software solution, so think back to, I was a massive Windows Phone fan, and I actually was one of the 3 people that liked Windows Phone from a hardware perspective. There are 2 people here. So.
I still have it and it works every day.
Yeah. So I think the way that Microsoft have gone about this from a software angle is, you know, you've got Azure Stack, and Azure Stack is really great and provides a lot of use cases there. But being able to leverage the software stack, regardless of the hardware that it's on, kind of makes them hedge their bets and have gone down a path that allows them to address these different scenarios. So the only other technology or similar type functionality that is out of the market at the moment is the Google Anthos, but it is very limited compared to Arc in terms of what it can do. But there's almost like an element of tie-in from a Google platform perspective, whereas whether you're on Google or VMware or AWS or Microsoft or Azure Stack, you know, you're being able to get these capabilities from a software perspective. So I think that's really the key differentiator here for Arc, is taking that software angle. And even, you know, I think it's been about 3 years ago, I think is when I did my first session on Arc, when it was still in private preview. And, you know, there's a lot of capabilities there, but then looking at, you know, what you can do now, there's so many different scenarios that can be addressed, both from an infrastructure perspective and the management side of things as well, that, you know, looking ahead, I can see kind of where it's going to land and what they're going to do with that as well. So just a quick overview from an architecture perspective. So on the left here, we've got Azure and we've got ARM. So from Resource Manager provider perspective, you know, you look at the kind of key domain areas that make up various capabilities within Azure. Then we've got the actual resource providers themselves. So from a server infrastructure provider perspective, there's kind of 2 main resource providers. There's a hybrid compute, which takes care of kind of the metadata service. And then we've got the extension attribute, which deals with the way that extensions and other capabilities that kind of complement the Arc agent, like Log Analytics, Sentinel, Defender for Cloud, etc., are kind of brought into place. So everything in the blue there is part of the kind of Arc ecosystem. And then you can see the various other data and Kubernetes pieces that kind of meet that as well. Ooh. All right. So I'll sit on this diagram for a while. So this is kind of an overarching view of how the integration kind of works together. So if we start down the bottom, we've got the different cloud providers and infrastructure layer. So we've got native Azure. So a lot of the management and capabilities that are in place today, they natively interact with APIs and can bring them on board. We've got Azure Stack HCI. So there's obviously a lot more looking at that hybrid approach. So we have kind of native integration at that layer as well. But then when we start looking at vSphere from an on-prem perspective, AWS and Google platform, these are various different components and various different infrastructure. So leveraging the agent capabilities from a server and infrastructure perspective, we're able to use that agent to then bring commonality at that Azure Arc kind of integration layer there. So when you look and think about threat protection and logging and monitoring and change tracking, so these are all services that customers or people that are using Azure today, you'll be comfortable with, but in the mindset of using it and running it within the Azure context. And then when we look at the above and the different kind of capabilities that are there, like it kind of opens up a lot of different scenarios about what we can kind of achieve to bring in those capabilities to this disparate hardware. So instead of having multiple consoles and multiple technologies to bring in those things today, we can leverage that Arc integration layer to be able to provide that layer and commonality across that as well. And the other key thing is when you talk about, and a lot of my conversations, like I said, I work with customers that have disparate environments and people using AWS and Google. This is kind of one of the key differentiators, and I was talking to the internal team this morning about, how would you position Microsoft over AWS and some of the competitors? Generally, it's around the security story. So, probably 4 or 5 years ago, Microsoft was kind of a dirty word in the security space. But those conversations that were originally challenging for me to have obviously changed, and that key differentiator around hybrid security and security in general is obviously very important now. Second one is around the hybrid management services, so taking that software approach and being able to leverage kind of the capabilities and great things that have been done in Azure across various environments is obviously very key. And then third is generally around licensing and Windows and Office. So that, those are the key areas that I usually talk to, and where I see something like this being kind of very important. So I guess, how does it work altogether from a kind of technical perspective? So when we look at the onboarding and how the identity and access management works within Arc, we've got Azure AD, we create a service principal. So that service principal is what is used to kind of onboard the service. So there's essentially 2 ways to do it. You can do it interactively or actively with a service principal or an account. So you grant that service principal permissions to the resource provider and to the layer Azure Connect the Machine Resource Administrator. So that basically it gives you the least amount of privileges you need to kind of onboard that system as well. So if you're doing it interactively, you'd log on with credentials. In the portal, you'd go through and it generates a PowerShell script that you can use to then onboard a server. So if you're pocking it and kind of testing a few servers, then that approach is quite good. Doesn't take a whole lot of time, doesn't require a whole lot of complexity to kind of get up and running, and at least allows you to play and get comfortable with that onboarding process. If you're rolling it out en masse to kind of larger environments, you want to kind of automate that with that service principal and be able to kind of onboard a large amount of servers as well. So if you're doing interactively, RDP into the machine, run the script, away you go. Within a couple of minutes, you'll see the object pop up into the Azure portal. It'll just look like a normal virtual machine that's there with a different kind of logo that looks like this kind of purple and blue bit down the bottom. So you will see that as a JSON or ARM object within the portal, which has all the metadata and stuff associated with that as well. So when we look at the Connect the Machine agent, so this is essentially the agent that uses to communicate with Azure. So this is very different to the log analytics and the Sentinel agent. So they work complementary together, but essentially they're kind of 2 different things. So you can onboard a server to Sentinel and to Defender just with the log analytics agent, but you don't get any of the management capabilities and extensibility that the Arc agent provides. So the Arc agent is just the agent to be able to bring it on board as an Arc managed machine, And then from that point in time, you've got the extensions that you can layer on top of that to do your various different capabilities, regardless of what you want to kind of bring on board. So the guest configuration extension service manages the extensions. So it'll look at all the extensions that are installed and then be able to manage those and upgrade those as you need. And the guest configuration service really deals with policy. So one of the cool things that I like about Arc and being a big Azure Policy person is being able to provide visibility not only at the control plane layer within the Azure portal, but inside the virtual machine as well. So when you think traditional group policy and control and settings within the virtual machine, it's kind of extracted from the data layer and the kind of configuration management and data plane and control plane layers. So using the guest configuration Azure policies, we can look inside the virtual machine and interrogate things like password policies and TLS settings and things like that you probably wouldn't get visibility across these kind of multiple disparate environments. And being able to surface them up in Azure Policy and see them from a compliance perspective is something that's really powerful as well. So from the onboarding perspective, as I talked about, so we've got the onboarding, and you can do it various different ways. And then once the servers are onboarded, we can obviously manage these extensions. So, Log Analytics has a lot of powerful capabilities. Complementing that with Sentinel as well gives you a really good visibility into platform monitoring and your kind of SIEM aspects as well. Azure Automation, Azure Monitor, and Defender, some other capabilities that people are pretty comfortable with. And Key Vault, managing certificates on end devices has always been challenging. So Arc and the VM extensions also integrates with Key Vault. So then you can manage the deployment of certificates to kind of your workloads there as well. On the left here, we've got the onboarding interfaces and how it can be done. So the good thing about it is regardless of where you sit in terms of your comfort factor, doing it through the portal, doing it through command line, doing it through Windows Admin Center, there's various different ways to be able to onboard the solution in the same manner, but using the tools that you're kind of comfortable as well with. One of my recent favorite capabilities is AutoManage. So AutoManage for Arc complements AutoManage for native Azure services. So someone that's done a lot of VM migrations and large-scale migrations of workloads. Before this came along, we developed our own kind of IP. So, you set up Azure Migrate or ASR in the appliance and you migrate the virtual machine across. And then part of that onboarding experience is you enroll it into cost management, into Azure Backup, into the monitoring. So all of these kind of cloud native tools that are there. So, you created your own IP and scripts to kind of onboard and do that, mixed you with some Azure Policy stuff. So it became really cohesive story to then make sure that when the virtual machine is kind of handed over to the operations team from a run state, then all of these kind of capabilities are lit up and they're enrolled into those services. So for anyone that's not aware of AutoManage, all it's doing is kind of taking all of those capabilities that are there and being able to roll them up into kind of a package and then allowing you to roll them out. So instead of having to build those capabilities yourself and take care of individual pieces, you can do this as a service. And then you can define these profiles. So the way you would do it for a production system may be different to a dev test. So in dev test, we may say, from a cost perspective, we don't need to back those VMs up because they're not critical. So in our dev test profile, we would exclude Azure Backup, for example. Or the level of updates and how we want to do those can be different between these different environments. So it's a good way to kind of onboard those pieces as well. So we can leverage this and complement this with Azure Arc and the extensibility to be able to do that and kind of unlock all of these kind of capabilities that are there. So from a connectivity perspective, so how do they communicate? And this is generally the first thing that a security and networking team want to get across. So we've essentially got three options to be able to onboard the system. So let's just say we've gone through, we've deployed the Arc agent onto the virtual machine. So it's running there now. So it communicates outbound on 443. So it's all TLS and encrypted already. So option one there is just straight outbound from your system to the internet to the Azure Management Control Plane. So generally, from a security perspective, it's fairly safe. It's just outbound. It's 443. It's already encrypted. So that'll work for a lot of customers. If there's a need or a customer has a proxy or they have very stringent security requirements, then obviously we can look at some of the other options there. So it works with a proxy, so you can do the same thing, outbound 443 to the proxy, or something that's kind of new and I personally haven't implemented it yet, but something that came out of preview not long ago is being able to use private link and private endpoints to do this capability. So this requires some prerequisites, which I'll go through in the next slide, to be in place, but essentially it allows you to leverage your express route circuit or your VPN private connectivity to kind of funnel that traffic from your on-prem environment into Azure, and then using the private link service and a private endpoint to hit the Azure Arc endpoints. So here's another diagram with a bit more of the components in it. So I won't talk about the proxy and the internet part. It's fairly trivial and straightforward. Anyone that's set up private endpoints and private link understands there's a lot of complexity there. So, you know, a lot of customers and network and security people are like, I want to use private endpoints and private link for everything because it's the most secure. So it is, but there is a lot of work that needs to kind of complement that in the back end. So setting up your DNS zones, setting up your networking, setting up all of the various things that need to be in place are important to make sure that once this stuff is operating, then it works and is in place. Not to mention the kind of DNS entries in the endpoints. So generally these private DNS zones are centralized in your kind of central hub. As an end user, you know, you wouldn't have access to do those. So you're not going to be able to go in and create DNS entries for your private endpoints. So then you need to work with Azure Policy and put things in place to kind of automate that piece and onboard that. So definitely possible, just quite a complex kind of piece of work. So what that means in terms of the Arc piece is we can leverage that and have that in place. But until recently, there were still some control channels that would still go via the internet. So the way that Azure Arc agent works at the kind of control plane level. So we look up the top there, we've got ARM and Azure Active Directory. So when we're interfacing with Azure Monitor and some of these capabilities, that will all work over private link and private endpoints. But it's in preview now, and until the preview came out about less than a month ago, anything to Azure AD and anything to the ARM resource provider would still go over the internet. So that was something that people weren't kind of aware of. So now you can create private endpoints for those services and then tunnel that traffic over the private endpoint as well. So like I said, definitely possible, just a quite complex piece of work to get everything working, and troubleshooting this can be quite challenging. These service tags are important as well because when you look at the different disparate environments of where the workload can come from, the service tag is used to define like the endpoint of where it exists. So if this is a VMware cluster, this would be your vCenter and the cluster that it's sitting on. If it's Google or AWS, it would be a metadata tag that corresponds to that set of resources or account in AWS or equivalent in Google Cloud. So it knows where the kind of system exists and lives. So not necessarily just on the server part, what I also thought I would present and kind of talk to. So this is a fairly new capability. So this is kind of going a bit outside the server part. But recently there was also a preview for VMware vSphere architecture for this. So this is not having the Azure Arc agent installed on a VM in your vCenter environment. So you can do that today. That's common. What this is really set up for is we've got this Azure Arc Resource Bridge component here. So essentially, this is a virtual appliance that you would install in your vCenter environment, and that provides the conduit between vCenter and Azure Management Plane, but it allows you to go into the portal and provision workloads from the Azure portal that sit on your vCenter environment. So I was an infrastructure guy before I was a cloud guy. So vCloud, if you think about vCloud Director and those kind of self-service capabilities or private cloud capabilities that exist, this allows you to leverage your skills and templates and capabilities within Azure. So you can use an ARM template or a Bicep template or Terraform to create an image. so a virtual machine image from Azure, and then the destination is a resource pool or an ESXi host on-prem. So pretty cool capabilities. And that kind of shows the extensibility of what we're working with and how that can be kind of brought together. So if you look at it from an Azure perspective, you'll see these VMware resources appear as ARM objects in the Azure portal. So your resource pools, your DCs, your virtual networking, anything that's presented from vCenter will kind of surface up in there as well. So, this is kind of the next evolution of where Arc is going towards. So today it's for ESXi, the same approach I would see used for Zen Server and other hypervisors that are out there, but almost provides that way to kind of still leverage your investment in VMware, but then leverage your capabilities and templates that you've got to provision them from the Microsoft portal or from the Azure portal. But, hybrid's here to stay. People are still going to need on-prem workloads and an on-prem destination. So it allows you to quite quickly get up and board with that. So as I said, this is fairly new. Definitely something I'm keen to kind of validate and POC because I think they're, especially in Australia, and I'm assuming it's the same in New Zealand, probably a lot of hosters and a lot of private cloud environments. And VMware was the de facto standard for virtualization. So I definitely think that there's a good opportunity to kind of look at this and kind of go through this as well. So I didn't have a demo have sorted, but I thought with, this was all very last minute, I didn't want to go through the demo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a customer scenario, and this is a use case for a customer that I worked on in Australia. And then I've got some stuff at the end, which is not a demo, but it will kind of give you how the demo would work and how you can kind of do it in your own environment. So this particular customer is a government agency that I worked with. So they are, like a lot of organizations, shadow IT and shadow cloud, if you call that now, was prevalent. So big user of Azure, had stuff in AWS, playing around with a little bit in Google Cloud, and still had a large kind of VMware footprint. So what they wanted to do, and the kind of guidance was, we just want to see visibility and understand what we've got from an operations perspective. And we, obviously being government, we align to IRAP and ISM. So we want to see where we are from a compliance perspective. So basically the requirements was, we have all of these different environments, mainly Windows, but they still had a flavor of various Linux workloads that are there as well, some SQL, and they wanted to be able to give the teams, because a lot of this stuff, so most of the corporate stuff was in Azure, but there was various pockets of kind of innovative teams that had done stuff in AWS in kind of a zero harm environment. So these workloads weren't necessarily network connected from an express route or private network connectivity to the corporate network, but they were still deemed as government systems and stuff that they were working on. So being able to provide that compliance was kind of key. So the first thing that we wanted to do was fairly simple, right? Was let's leverage the capability of the tagging and metadata and resource graph, which is a really cool capability to get across. Let's just understand what we've got. So we can put metadata and tags in to understand who owns it. We can put some cost center information, various different locations of where things are. Just surface that kind of metadata information across all of the different environments. So we picked 5 servers from Google Cloud and AWS, 10 from VMware. They weren't using Azure Stack, so forget that one. And then the rest of them were obviously in Azure. So we looked at the tagging structure and going through kind of a well-architected landing zone project already. These governance capabilities that we had in Azure around the tags were already in place. So let's just look at some of those, complement some other tags to that, and then kind of push them out. And because these objects appeared in the portal as an ARM object, then basically we could use that metadata and push these tags to those information. So that gave them at least some visibility, and then they could look holistically in kind of one pane of glass, if you will, and see the 20 plus the Azure workloads in kind of one interface and understand where they were and what they were doing. So that was quite a straightforward piece to do. Second one was probably a bit more value based on their licensing posture and what they were access to. They had just moved off Splunk to use Sentinel as their SIEM. So that was something that they were doing in the background anyway. They're already using Security Center or Defender for Cloud now for that. So leveraging the log analytics agent, we then pushed that agent out to the rest of the machines. So, that already existed for stuff that was in Azure, but wasn't really done in a programmatic fashion for anything outside of that because there was no deployment mechanism. There was no controls to make sure that that was done. So some of them already had the agent on. The agent was then pointing to various different workspaces. So, again, lack of governance and stuff that was in place. So we pushed out the agent. Once the agent's installed above and beyond the Arc agent, now we have the ability with Azure Policy to make sure that they're enrolled into all of these services. So once the Arc agent is installed, there's a policy initiative which allows you to automatically deploy the log analytics agent out to the VMs with the deploy if not exist policy. So you don't have to worry about manually going in and doing the other pieces that we talked about. You can leverage policy to kind of automate all of that. So then when new things come on board later, they're already onboarded for these services, enrolled into the right workspace, lit up in Defender for Cloud, and then they're enabled for these various kind of Defender plans as well. So that gave them a bit of visibility into the security posture of these workloads running in the different cloud environments. And lastly, the most important thing from their perspective was compliance. So, aligning to the ISM, which I know there's a similar type policy for New Zealand government as well. So this was just more around, not necessarily enforcement, because if you're aware, a lot of these policy initiatives for compliance are more auditing and understanding where you are on alignment to things like ISO and CIS and the ISM, etc. So we wanted to leverage the built-in Australian government ISM policy initiative, which is made up of about 160 policies, I think, across the various different layers. And then we just wanted to apply that through Azure Policy to these workloads. So because the Arc agent was there as a prerequisite, now these servers started reporting into Azure Policy, and we start to see where the kind of compliance and where they are on a compliance level, which is a good thing, but also, also was a scary thing because it highlighted the, that shadow cloud and how things were being done, because this is stuff that was inside the VM and how they've been created. So there was a lot of, good information that came out of that and helped a lot, but it also showed that, from a governance perspective, now at least they can enforce some of these things with other policies, but then also give a good idea of a starting point to then go and kind of uplift the compliance as a whole across the environment. So, those things sounds very complicated, but the capabilities and how you can achieve this is quite simple in terms of its kind of execution. The key thing about these use cases is looking at what you want to achieve. There is so much to do, so looking at the specific use cases and what you want to get out of it, whether it's governance or compliance, if you focus on those things and then expand from that later, it gives you a lot more value and a lot more importance out of that as well.
So when you talk about just what you just said about being the compliance and coming up to it, I guess then that's a good thing, because then you start having your standards.
Correct. So there's some, you start having it.
Repeat the question.
Sorry, what was it? Say the question again.
We just need to make sure the folks online can hear the question as well.
So,
right. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So the question was, like, when you have these, now you're surfacing this information through these policies, going back and kind of looking at the standards that you've got. So now that we have that information there, so there's some standards like ISM which they have to comply to regardless. But a lot of people on this journey now are looking and going, maybe we align to NIST or we align to ISO and align to these various other standards that are there, but maybe we haven't chosen one yet. So at least now it's quite easily, to be able to get this information surfaced and then figure out how do you want to change your organization and kind of adjust your policies to kind of work in this place, because especially government in Australia is very slow adopter to these various different things. So, you know, they're supposed to align from a compliance perspective, but a lot of them don't for various different reasons. At least this became very visible and is something that they can take higher up. If it becomes a funding thing, it allows you to go back and get money and be able to kind of go through these things as well. So at the end of it, so this is a POC or pilot. So the key benefits for the organization at the end was they have an asset or a CMDB now of those workloads that exist in Azure as ARM objects. We use Azure Resource Graph to build out that cloud CMDB, if you will, and then they can see them from the Azure portal as well. We have a universal governance strategy across the disparate environments using Azure Policy. And because at this point they were just focused on virtual machines, leveraging the agents from Arc and from Log Analytics, we now have a centralized view from a security governance compliance perspective as well. They didn't use the update management side of things, but that's the next evolution of what they want to do. So starting at these other use cases allowed them to say, well, actually then, now that these workloads are running over here, how are we going to patch them? These are not joined to the domain, but you still want to go through those kind of capabilities. So you could go and install WSUS and SCCM, but then you would have to address your networking and allow it to connect to a central repository. So their stance on this was, these are important for now, but we still want to make sure that they're updated using patches that we approve, but let's leverage some of the SaaS capabilities of update management to be able to do that. We had the compliance, we've got that central view. And the other thing they were looking at, essentially they're kind of turning into a service provider themselves internally. So this government agency does various different things. And the way that they function is they have corporate IT, but then they have these other streams of work that the business comes to them and says, I have this problem, you need to solve it. So they're working around, essentially becoming a service provider. So the other good thing, which I have a slide for at the end, is around Azure Lighthouse. So Azure Arc integrates with Azure Lighthouse. So as a hoster or a service provider, you can now see visibility into customers' Azure environments. So you can do that today, so that's comfortable and people are used to that. But because those Arc objects appear in the Azure portal now, you get visibility into on-prem and kind of hybrid cloud environments. So from a management perspective, you're able to see and provide management services across both Azure and on-prem workloads. Which is the next slide. So this is kind of how it looks. So you got your kind of MSP tenant up the top there. So anyone that's not familiar with Lighthouse, it's essentially a delegation service that allows you to get invited into a customer's tenant with a specific set of permissions to then provide management services over their environment using your credentials. So for example, from an Insight perspective, I can use my Insight account. I get invited into an access package essentially to Fabricam's Azure environment as a B2B user. Then I can see, I have permissions to see certain things within their environment. And now I can see not only the Azure services I have access to, but I can also see anything that has been Arc enabled and is kind of surfaced up there as well. So, and this allows you to be able to, me as an Insight employee, will be able to see multiple kind of tenants that we manage. So anyone that's done consulting and had multiple accounts with different customers and passwords knows how painful it is to kind of manage. So it kind of brings in all of those into kind of a central location as well. So basically just complements those things that are there. So lastly, so I'll talk about the Azure Jumpstart project. So this is kind of in lieu of the demo. So there's a guy called Lior, can't pronounce his last name, but he's one of the program managers for Azure Arc, really cool guy, one of those kind of Microsoft people that is more like an evangelist. He's the one, so all those diagrams there are not mine, they're all from him. So he's created this website, and there's a link here to Jumpstart Lightning and Jumpstart ArcBox, but essentially it's got all of these different scenarios. So when you think of all the scenarios we've kind of talked about, as well as some more in the Kubernetes and data space, the website and all the material there has been set up to kind of address all of this. So The Lightning is more of a YouTube channel with various showcases and presentations. But there's a lot of information and templates and things there to deploy it into your environment to play around with, but also to kind of test it out. So so just what it looks like. So whether you're a Terraform guy, Bicep, or ARM, so it's almost like a orchestrated hydration kit to test all these capabilities. So depending on what service you want to focus on, if it's more infrastructure-led, whether Windows or Linux, Kubernetes or the data services, he provides this capability to go and install it. So the good thing about this is you don't need to have access to these different environments. So what it does, you deploy a VM. So it's a pretty beefy VM, so you need to understand the cost, and there's some things in there. It tells you how much it costs to run it a month, so you don't get sticker shock. But it deploys one VM in Azure and enables it for nested virtualization, and then installs the VMs inside of that to simulate the Azure Arc pieces. So if you try and enable Azure Arc in an Azure VM, it will stop you. And so there's a service there, the Windows Azure Guest Service, which is what it communicates with Azure. So that kind of like butts against the Arc service. So you can hack around it, but it's not supported and not recommended. So essentially the Hyper-V host is just a blank VM. Enable it for Hyper-V, nested virtualization. You provision the virtual machines inside there as guests that simulate Windows or physical machines in these different environments. And then you onboard them through post-provisioning scripts to Arc. So that allows you to quickly be able to kind of go through all these different scenarios without. So until this came along, and the last time I did this session, I had to spin up a Google environment, a VMware environment, an AWS environment, which just took a long time. It was very painful to do. So at least this now is a good way to be able to kind of get through those different capabilities. And here's kind of the automation flow of how it works. So like I said, regardless of, I'm a Bicep guy, so this is all the Bicep way of doing it, but it's kind of one template with multiple modules in there. And the good thing about it is you can kind of pick your flavor. If you're not really interested in the Kubernetes or data piece and just want to focus on the VMware or the server component, you can do that. And then it also provisions a client VM, which is essentially your piece that you do all the kind of bootstrapping from. So when it's been deployed, you log into that VM via Bastion or something, and then you bootstrap the environment and run the scripts, which then onboards all of the different workloads into Arc and allows you to do it. And then you can kind of delete it at the end. So if you want to kind of play around with it, it's probably a good way of being able to do that as well in a kind of safe and segregated manner. And then you can take it from there based on what you want to do. So yeah, there's a lot of information there. So I'll send these slides out afterwards, and there's links to where you can access this and information that's there. So it's community driven as well, but there's a good team around providing capabilities and kind of building that out as well as we go. So I think that's the last slide. Last slide. So just some key takeaways to get started. Whether you're interested in the server component, Kubernetes or data, so depending on your role and what interests you, you can obviously look at it. So everything we talked about today is just scratching the surface on the server component. So when you go into data and K8s, for example, there's a lot more stuff that's there. So, it's a big piece of work that, even someone like myself is not across everything that's available. Those links there. So the Azure Arc Jumpstart is the kind of landing page that has all that information, the technical documentation, and there's some good learning material on Microsoft Learn if you just want to understand a little bit more about what I've talked about and kind of where it's coming from today. Cool. Okay. Well, that's it. Thanks for people that came in person for joining me today. I guess now we can open it up to any questions in the room or online and take it from there.
I have some questions. So one thing is about the AWS. So, just correct me if I'm wrong, if I understand correctly. So you have to run some extra agent to communicate to the Arc services, right?
Yep.
So
I'll get you to repeat the question, sorry.
Yep.
So, and also you mentioned that one thing is that EC2 as well as SQL server, right?
Yep.
Correct me if I'm wrong, that AWS does not provide the direct access to SQL servers. You can't able to SSH them and you can't able to install any service there. So how can you communicate to SQL servers on the AWS?
Yeah, so the question was if you're using AWS, so you've got EC2 instances, so that you can install the Arc agent on them and they deploy, you would see them in the Azure portal as just VMs. So you can also install you can also install SQL inside those ES2 instances. So you won't necessarily have the same templates as you would in Azure, which is bootstrapped environment, which I think is what you're talking about. But if you install the component or the SQL component there, even though you've manually installed SQL inside that ES2 instance, you can still have them show up. So one thing I just remember now, one thing that is important and probably a good segue. So last Tuesday, so when I flew out to Sydney, so July 12th, if anyone was aware, was the last day for SQL 2012. So if a lot of people still have SQL 2012, so your options are, you pay extended support. Options are you don't do nothing, and then you're obviously at risk. You pay extended support, which is very, very expensive. But another thing, which personally I didn't realize until I had a workshop with Microsoft for a customer with a large SAP environment, if you install the agents on your SQL, so you got SQL 2012 servers on-prem, for example, you install and you onboard them to Azure Arc, that means that you're allowed from a licensing perspective to get the extended security updates. So stuff that's still on 2012 is generally stuff that's probably hard, and they're not going to move it anytime soon. So anyone's having conversation a week before July 12 is obviously not going to address that. But as a segue, it's easier path to least resistance to install Arc on those SQL servers and have them report to Azure Arc to then get the extended security updates. At least then you're getting some visibility into it. Microsoft are kind of helping you along that way as a pathway to eventually, modernize or move to a newer version of SQL paths, etc. So that's a good use case for it, even in the short term, to address those kind of those workloads. Same thing will be in October whenever the OS 2012 OS goes into support. Same kind of concept applies.
Got a question from online from Matt Seller. Does using the Windows Admin Center in the Azure portal require the installation of Arc agent for any non-Azure VMs?
Does the Windows? So the question was, if you're using Windows Admin Center, do you still need to install the Arc agent on the end user device or on the servers that are reporting in? So all Windows Admin Center does is the interface to be able to do it. You would still need to push out. So you can either do it natively through Windows Admin Center, or you can push out the agent through SCCM or other mechanisms. So as far as I'm aware, you still need to install the agent on those machines. So just because it's reporting into Windows Admin Center doesn't mean it's enabled for Arc, if that's the question.
Just ask them to unmute if they want to. So sounds like.
And that's the thing. There's like the scenarios that I went through today. There's so much stuff that's available. Windows Admin Center, I've used it a little bit, but I don't really do much operations. So there's so many different permutations and things that are available. So if you're leveraging, SCCM or Windows Admin Center or Policy, there's various different ways to kind of onboard them as well. But essentially, unless it's an Azure machine to begin with, you still need to get the Arc agent on there at some stage. Either you bake that into your image before you deploy it, regardless of where you're deploying it, or you do it post-deployment through provisioning script or something. It needs to have that hybrid agent on there, so then it knows where to kind of connect into the management plane, because it's all about making sure that kind of identity is in place, because once the service principal and the managed identity kind of fit together, that's providing that authentication mechanism to allow it to continue to run and report in. So if, for example, the communication channel goes down between that workload and the Azure management plane, workload will still run, so you have no issues there. You're just going to lose all the visibility you get from the integration with Arc. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind. Any other questions?
Does the Azure Arc template for those VMs, does that enable you to control like what packages that are installed on the Linux machine Or like, is
As
that,
extensions, you mean?
yeah.
Yep, you can do that as well. Obviously, your moleys may vary depending. So from a supportability, anything Windows 2008 to new is supported. Same thing from a Linux perspective, your traditional distros and so forth. So there's templates to onboard the VM as an Arc VM first. You can also install the extensions into the same template. The challenge today is there's no easy way to update them. So let's just say you wanted to enable all of these extensions within the template, or even manually, right? Regardless of that, there's no automated mechanism through a template to then update those agents. So unless those extensions support auto update, which a lot of them, especially for Linux, wouldn't, that's the challenge today around that. So the Arc agent itself and log analytics agents, pretty straightforward. There's that cadence to update them is fairly simple. But when you're talking about extensions, because it's not necessarily an agent like you would install into it, it's almost like a script extension. There's no easy way to be able to kind of update them as of today, which I'm assuming hopefully will change over time.
And do this agent run in as a root permissions or just normal user?
So yes, so good question. So the question was, what permissions do you need for the Arc agent? So Linux, you obviously need to have root permissions on the box, which is it's a Linux thing, unfortunately. And with Windows, you just need to be a local admin on that server. So that's where, when you look at how you do it interactively versus using a service principal, generally that would be the better way to do it. Set up the service principal, get that all working, and then you're not using credentials to kind of log on and manage it. The credentials you use for the service principal, though, is only done at the time of installation. So after that, you can kill the service principal, the permissions if you want. So creating that identity to do that piece is a prerequisite, but it doesn't need to persist, because after it's in place, the managed identity itself is going to manage all that communication.
Yeah, is there anything that you can think of that with Azure Arc is sort of like missing compared to a native Azure machine, like feature-wise?
So I said Azure Backup, which I kind of, after I said it, so that's one that doesn't. So when I talked about Azure AutoManage, so because of the way that Azure Backup works, so the question was for people online, is there anything that Arc is missing today compared to some of the native services? So Azure Backup's probably the main one that I see. So you can still use Azure Backup to manage VMs regardless of Arc in other environments at the moment. But to do that, you need to install the agent inside the VM. So anyone that's familiar with the Mars agent, which is the old DPM agent, but that's doing VMs inside the VM, like it's doing backups inside the VM at kind of like a file and folder level. When you use Azure Backup in Azure, you're obviously taking like a snapshot of the VM. Because Azure won't have access to those APIs and stuff that's in AWS and Google and on-prem, you can't take those snapshots of those as you can today. So that's probably the only one that's really missing. Everything else, because it's agent-based, is much easier to do. Same with like Kubernetes and SQL. It's installing, it's not an agent per se, but it's still installing something in the cluster to kind of simulate that. So stuff that supports APIs is much easier to do, but backup's probably the only one that I see as a challenge. But then when you look at that, it's more about kind of the management and governance side of things. Even if you could do that and you were going to back up, say, an AWS VM with Azure Backup, you're going to have to back it up to somewhere. So it's either going to have to go to S3 or another location. Would you really want to pull that across the wire and do it that way? Not sure. So that's probably the only caveat that I've been across. The rest of them from those management tool sets are great, especially when you're talking to VM, because now you can interrogate inside the VM using resource graph inside the virtual machine to kind of pull out that information and build that CMDB is obviously quite powerful. Cool. Yeah.
So at the moment, as I understand, obviously there's possibility of having agents on an OS-based scenario, whether that be on-prem or in different cloud. What's the path forward for having to use some of the sort of PaaS services on different cloud platforms and still trying to integrate those PaaS services into Azure now?
Yeah. So when you come to the PaaS, so the question was, for VMs and IaaS, pretty straightforward, right? Because you have, you're installing an agent inside the virtual machine. Where the direction, and when you start talking about like PaaS services, you obviously don't have control at that level, right? So you're just looking at it from a SQL DB or app service plan perspective. That's really where the kind of APIs will come in place. So I'm assuming a lot of the work there is going to be looking at the various APIs, specifically from, say, Google and AWS, and what Azure does to try and do that translation kind of in between. So that's really when, if you remember the diagram about the VMware resource bridge, that concept. So at the moment it's a virtual appliance, but that concept is basically providing that integration layer between the two, doing that natively with APIs. I'm sure there's ways to be able to do that, but it always comes down to the kind of lowest common denominator. A VM is a VM regardless of the environments. Kubernetes cluster is also the same. SQL, Postgres, you have some level of commonality across the cloud platforms. So you're always going to be limited by that lowest common denominator. So, there'll only be so far that you can go to making it, nirvana or working. But, there are a lot more smarter people at Microsoft than me, so I'm sure they will figure out a way to at least make it suitable in the future.
Question from online. Do you see many customers using Azure Policy guest configuration with Azure Arc enabled service?
Yep, that's probably the most, to be honest, it's probably the most relevant one that I see outside of onboarding to Defender and Log Analytics or Sentinel, which, as I said, you can do today without the Arc agent. It's just you lose a lot of that management capabilities. But a lot of customers on-prem environment, the way that you would do it normally is through group policy. The need to be able to have these machines on the domain and doing various different things now kind of negates a lot of that stuff if you can still control them through patching and policy configuration on them. So being able to use Azure Policy to set a baseline of configuration inside the virtual machine, instead of then joining its domain and having those kind of corporate policies on, that's where a lot of people are kind of moving towards. So there's always going to be, like anyone that's familiar with Intune and code management, and you had SCCM and then you had Intune, and they kind of did two different things. Then they kind of converged and you use code management to do both of those. Being able to leverage the guest policy configuration of Azure Policy to do a lot of your configuration there at least negates a lot of the heavy lifting or your traditional group policy that you would need to do it. And even if you're just looking at it from a control plane perspective, without even looking at the guest policy, there's still a lot of value there. But I definitely see people, that's one of the carrots that I see people moving towards. Cool. Guess that's it. Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Well, thanks, Stephen.